is a story I've carried for 24 years, something I've rarely discussed since childhood, and never on a public platform like this. You're entitled to your doubts. In fact, I encourage skepticism towards any information you receive. I'm sharing this now because, as I've aged and spent over 2 decades building a life, I've borne an immense burden that therapists and psychiatrists have dismissed as repressed memories or, at worst, delusions. This is a story I've carried for 24 years, something I've rarely discussed since childhood, and never on a public platform like this. You're entitled to your doubts. In fact, I encourage skepticism towards any information you receive. I'm sharing this now because, as I've aged and spent over 2 decades building a life, I've borne an immense burden that therapists and psychiatrists have dismissed as repressed memories or, at worst, delusions. I am not from here. And by here, I don't just mean my current location. I mean the reality any of us inhabit. It's a few days past my 30th birthday, a time that always affects me because I started kindergarten on my 5th birthday. I assumed back then that was standard. You turn 5, you go to school. I didn't realize my birthday just happened to fall on the first day of school. In about 2 weeks, it will be exactly 24 years since my entire world disappeared. I was born in San Diego and grew up in a less affluent suburb. I lived in an apartment complex called Lemon Vine Apartments, which were a more rundown version of the Lemon Vine Apartments in Lemon Grove, another San Diego suburb. My parents were divorced but remained on amicable terms. My mother was young when she had me, and she was stunning. In her early 20s, she aspired to be a model and frequently traveled to LA for photo shoots, doing glamour modeling for magazines. With a quarter Indian heritage, from India, not Native American, she had an exotic look. My most cherished childhood picture of her was from a bridal company shoot, where she modeled a luxurious wedding dress. I used to sleep with that photo when she was in LA, and I stayed with my dad, who worked for the city of San Diego. They shared custody fairly evenly, and we even celebrated Christmas together as a family, my dad, his girlfriend, my mom, who was single, and me, even though they had separated when I was a baby. Perhaps things weren't as harmonious as I recall, but I was only 6. If there was underlying drama, they did an excellent job shielding me from it. On September 17, 1996, I was at my dad's parents' place in Riverside, California. They owned a small farm with chickens, pigs, and goats, no larger livestock like horses or sheep. However, my grandma had several pet ducks that would eat from your hand, fly off, and return annually like clockwork. My dad had a week of night shifts, and my mom was in LA, so I stayed with my grandparents. Schools were quite understanding about such arrangements back then, and I was sent home with typical first-grader assignments for a student just back from summer break. The 17th marked my 3rd day at my grandparents'. My grandpa had cautioned me to be careful outdoors because he'd spotted a rattlesnake and wasn't sure of its whereabouts. So, with the snake's location a mystery, 6-year-old me decided to go on a hunt for it. In retrospect, allowing a child to search a farm for a rattlesnake probably isn't in any parenting guide, but it was the 90s, and I suppose they didn't actually think I'd find it. There were woods on the property where I wasn't allowed, so they likely assumed the snake had gone there. I spent the entire day playing Jungle Explorer on the farm, trying to track down this rattlesnake. And to my great excitement, when I decided to open the well house, which, for those unfamiliar, resembles one of those green electrical boxes by the roadside, there it was, curled up and rattling. I immediately slammed the door shut and ran to my grandparents' house to announce my discovery. My 6-year-old memory might be exaggerating, but I'm fairly certain that snake was at least 900 feet long, give or take. But I found it. I was thrilled to tell my grandpa, so he could, well, do what he did and go shoot it. I burst in through the back door, which led into the laundry room and then the kitchen. I paid no attention to anything until I turned left into the living room, expecting to find my grandparents, my uncle, and the neighboring couple all seated where I'd left them. Except they weren't there, and it wasn't the same living room anymore. The furniture was completely different. The hard, memorably uncomfortable hardwood furniture my grandpa cherished was gone. The coffee table he'd fashioned from a tree stump was missing. In their place was fluffy, grandma-style furniture. A 3-person sofa with a floral pattern. The TV in the wrong spot and newer than my grandpa's old sit-on-the-floor cabinet model. The hardwood paneling on the walls was gone, or at least concealed by blue wallpaper. The hardwood floor was now a shaggy, off-white carpet. The pictures of my dad, my uncle, me, and my grandparents were absent from the walls, replaced by paintings and photos of strangers. As bewildered as I was by this, I was more confused by everyone's absence. In my 6-year-old mind, I could accept that they might have completely rearranged the house while I spent the day hunting a snake, but I couldn't believe they'd all just abandoned me. And I hadn't seen anyone leave. I hadn't seen cars drive away. So I walked out the front door, which was connected to the living room, as they usually are, thinking perhaps they'd gone to check on the chickens or the pigs. Both should have been visible from the front porch, but the chicken coop was gone, the pig pen had lost its fencing, and there were no pigs in sight. At this point, I was utterly confused and becoming very frightened. I didn't want to be alone, and I couldn't see anyone. Even though they lived on a small farm, the neighbors who had been visiting lived just across the dirt road. So I ran down our dirt driveway and across the road to their house, convinced that must be where everyone had gone. I remember getting more and more scared as I ran, and I recall starting to cry when their house was the wrong color. It wasn't the faded yellow house it used to be. It wasn't even the same house anymore. Nevertheless, I banged on the door. I remember by then I was crying quite heavily, not understanding what was happening, and I kept wiping my face, which smeared it with dirt from digging under stumps and logs for snakes all day. When the door opened and a woman in her late 40s to early 50s answered, someone I'd never seen before, I just started bawling uncontrollably. Everything after this point is largely a haze because nothing was right. I knew where I lived. I knew my school. I knew where my grandparents lived. But the people who lived where my grandparents lived were not my grandparents. I didn't know them. I pleaded for them to get my uncle to tell them who I was, but my uncle wasn't there. Through a series of encounters with police and people in suits, I was brought back to my hometown after spending what felt like 10 hours at the local police station trying to contact my parents. I had my home phone number memorized, but told them my dad would be asleep. When they called that number, the person on the other end had no idea who I was or what they were talking about. I was asked to give the police officers my address and sat in the local police station while police in my hometown went to that address. When they finally called the station back, they reported that the name of the apartment building was incorrect. Lemonvine Apartments apparently didn't exist, and the address I gave them belonged to an apartment complex called Merritt Manor. The apartment number I provided was unoccupied. I believe at this point they assumed I had given them the wrong apartment name and number, but that I did, in fact, live there. When I was finally brought to my hometown, after being passed between different police officers a couple of times, I was asked for my address again, and was driven to where I lived. That was it. That was my apartment complex. But just like everything else, it looked wrong. It was painted a different color, and the sign that used to feature a large lemon and red lemon vine now said Merritt Manor. I led the police directly to where I lived, and just as they'd been told, no one lived there. From then on, the police tried to contact neighbors, all of whom should have known me, but none of them were the right people. Every person who emerged from the surrounding apartment buildings was a stranger, and they didn't know me. Next, they attempted to contact my father, which should have been straightforward since he worked for the city. But apparently, no employee with his name worked for the city in any capacity. As day turned into night, and I spent endless hours sitting in the police station while they tried to find anyone in the world who knew me, I couldn't do anything but cry and cry and cry endlessly. A woman in a suit, whom I think was either a detective or just someone who worked at the station, sat with me for several hours trying to keep me calm. She gave me a stuffed dog, a Dalmatian puppy that resembled one of the dogs from 101 Dalmatians, and told me his name was Sparky. She said I could keep Sparky, and that when they found my parents, Sparky would go home with me and make sure I didn't get lost again. She said he was a good dog and would protect me if I took care of him. During this time, they tried my school. I told them I went to Shawnee Elementary. It was easy to find, very close to where I lived. But, as you might guess, a school by that name did not exist. My school was now apparently called Anza Elementary. At one point, I was asked if the police had ever taken my fingerprints, and they had. In kindergarten, my entire class had our fingerprints taken by the police in the school gym floor. Well, for situations exactly like this, unsurprisingly, this didn't help at all. They couldn't find my parents, my grandparents, my neighbors, my apartment, or even me. They couldn't even find me. I was too young to remember my social security number, but I severely doubt it would have mattered. They asked for my birthday and any relevant information that could help them figure out who I was and where I belonged, but nothing I told them yielded any information about me. At some point during the day, I was briefly taken to the ER, as the police suspected I might have sustained some kind of head injury. After a doctor examined me, they found nothing wrong, and I was sent back to the police station. I ended up staying with someone that night. I'm not entirely sure who it was, someone from Child Services, I imagine. I couldn't stop crying long enough to really focus on what was happening after this point. I'd cried myself to sleep several times in the police station, and cried myself to sleep again at the house I stayed at that night, despite the woman I was staying with, not the same woman who gave me Sparky, doing everything in her power to calm me. I clung to Sparky so hard I'm surprised I never popped his head off. I didn't have my picture of my mom. I didn't know what was going on, and no one could find out where I belonged. This didn't make sense to me. I was only 6, and just barely. I lived where I lived, my parents were my parents, and my school was my school. They didn't just all disappear one day. In between fits of crying and waking up, I begged to go home. I begged for the lady I was staying with to try and call my dad again. I just kept begging to go home. Over the next few days, I was interrogated and questioned by different people at different times, in different places, at all hours of the day. Police, investigators, people from departments I still don't know, child psychologists. Everyone under the sun was asking me questions. I was shuttled back and forth between the police station and the house I was staying at, until eventually, someone told me they thought they'd located my parents and they were coming to get me. Finally, I was going home. Finally, this was over. Finally, I could get away from all these strange people asking me the same questions over and over again. When the couple showed up at the police station, my heart sank to my feet as they were not my parents. But they'd had a son who had gone missing, and I fit his description pretty closely. The woman started crying when she saw me because she immediately knew I wasn't her missing son. But I was out of tears to cry at this point. Eventually, I was collected by Child Services and taken to a foster family where I stayed for a few months. The police launched a campaign, asking for anyone to come forward with information about me. They took my picture at the police station for the newspapers to put on the news. I never let go of Sparky for even a second. They didn't want me to hold him in the photo because I didn't have him when I arrived, but I needed him and would throw an immense tantrum when someone tried to take him away. They had me put back on the clothes I was wearing when they found me, but they'd since given me new clothes to wear. In those months I spent at the foster home, parents of missing children would come to the house to see if I was their child. I didn't realize this was what was happening until I was older and looked back on it. They didn't just pull me out and say, "Is this your kid?" They were a bit more subtle about it. The parents would come to meet me, and upon realizing I was not their missing child, they'd often leave in tears. Looking back at all these families that came to see me in desperation that they were going to have their child back, I feel so horrible for them. It's a feeling I can't really explain. Like a type of guilt, like I wish I had been their child so they could have them back and know they were safe. Most of those people probably never saw their children again, but I try to imagine that all of them were reunited, even though I know that isn't likely. This guilt was one of the things that kept me in therapy as an adult. But as I said, no therapist has ever bought my story or believed what I've said. The most common belief suggested to me has always been that I was abandoned as a child and lived in an abusive home, dumped on the side of a dirt road in the middle of farmland, and I repressed all the negative memories I had of my past. I didn't stay in that foster home permanently. Eventually, while my case wasn't officially closed, I needed to start going to school, and I needed identification. I was issued a birth certificate for the year I told them was my birth year, but the day and month were listed as September 17th, the day I was found. I never understood why they didn't just use the day and month of my actual birth, but I imagine it was because they didn't think I actually knew what it was. My name was unchanged. I started going to school sporadically. One of the child psychologists who had seen me recommended I not be placed back into a full curriculum immediately, and suspected I suffered some form of PTSD. I was put in the special class and was only made to go to school twice a week initially. Eventually, I started going to school full-time and changed foster homes a few more times. I really can't say how much time passed before it happened, but eventually, I was placed up for adoption. I was never actually told I was up for adoption, so I'm not sure how soon after I was found it was. But eventually, people started coming to meet me. These people weren't looking for a missing child, they were looking to adopt one. But I definitely did not represent myself as a good candidate. I had a story that no one believed or could verify. I insisted my parents would eventually find me, and I rarely had a day that I wasn't crying until my eyes burned. This story doesn't have a happy ending. I never saw my parents again, and I was a ward of the state until I was 18, and went nowhere from there. My teens were filled with delinquency, and I did a brief stint in something similar to juvie in San Diego called chaparral. I never went to college, and never really started getting my life together until I was around 24. I haven't talked publicly about this before now, at least not since I was a child speaking to everyone who was trying to figure out where I came from. I still have Sparky. He's old and worn, still in one piece. No longer white, he's now a dark shade of gray. He sits on my dresser and is there, just like he always has been, as long as I've been here. The story I'm about to tell you is strange. Not scary exactly, just strange. It's one of those things that seems impossible, but I swear on everything I have that it's 100% true. You can But I also felt like I'd left behind another life. I grieved it, even though it never really happened. For months after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It stayed with me. I lived every moment of that other version of my life. It was as real as anything I've ever experienced. I can't explain it. Maybe it was a psychological break. Maybe it was something else. But I won't forget it. Hey, I'm not really sure where to turn with this, so I figured maybe strangers on the internet might be able to give me some advice, or at least help me feel less crazy. I have autism, and since I was around 11 years old, I was alone and a little less scared. I used to work at a casino. One night, an elderly woman approached me asking how to page someone over the intercom. I started explaining where she needed to go, but she insisted I walk her to the desk myself. still think about it often. But just recently something clicked. That part she mentioned about the coworker, the one that didn't make sense back then, suddenly made perfect sense. A few years ago, that exact situation unfolded in my life. The person she described down to the last detail. I met them. The dynamics, the warning, it all happened just like she said. And it all started nearly 7 years to the day from when she spoke to me. I hadn't met that person back then, and I was working in a completely different place, in another state entirely. I honestly don't know what to make of it. I'm open to this kind of stuff, but always approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Still, this is one of the strangest things I've ever experienced, and I've never been able to explain it.